Helden in der Unterwelt is the third part of the Return of the Hero series, and I'll be reviewing it with the assumption that you, the viewer, are aware of the other earlier parts of the series, namely Return of the Heroes and Under the Shadow of the Dragon. Being a part of the series, it has some things in common with the other ones. It has these counters which have monsters and things on it. It has the same sorts of character cards that are male and female on one side, male on the other. It has treasures you can pick up and cubes, but it is a bit of a departure at the same time. For one, you don't have those big beautiful maps. You have these small tiles that are kind of represent this drab underworld. Furthermore, the theme has taken a step away from the sort of generic fantasy theme to more of a generic Greek mythology theme. So that's a big change. Otherwise, there are some large gameplay alterations as well, and I think I'd like to focus on those because that's probably what's the most interesting to you and to me. Beyond the standard kind of dungeon crawling, draw and add a tile mechanism, there are three main gameplay ways that this game is different from its two predecessors. The one is gray dot monsters, then you also have shadow cubes, and then finally you have dueling, which is interplayer direct conflict. When a player has to confront a gray dot monster, that's a monster with a gray dot here, they have to fight with their lowest experienced area, so their skill with the least amount of cubes. So our female gnomon here would have to fight with her green skill, which she has no cubes at all in, so she'd only be able to roll 2 dice and hope to get a 3, which she did not, so she would be injured. Since most of the monsters in the game have gray dots, a lot of the game is trying to decide whether or not to put cubes on your best skill or not, or trying to keep your cubes advancing more evenly than you would in other games. Shadow cubes do a couple of things. You get them when you lose to particular monsters, and you have to put them on your character card. They work like experience cubes, which is kind of nice. However, you can't get new experience in an ability that has shadow cubes in it. You can get rid of shadow cubes, but if an ability has shadow cubes, forget advancing that ability in the conventional sense. Also, shadow cubes are placed during certain times on Der Verdammt, which is the big bad guy. The more shadow cubes the Verdammt has, the stronger he is, and the harder the Verdammt is to defeat. If Der Verdammt's shadow cubes get up to here, then the heroes lose the game. Shadow cubes are also the basis for duels. A player has to have a shadow cube in order to duel another player, or if a player has a shadow cube, then the other player can duel that player. Shadow cubes are sort of the ethics of this game. The more shadow cubes you have, the more wicked your hero is. In fact, if the Der Verdammt gets enough cubes to end the game, the player with the most shadow cubes gets what's called a minor victory. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So how a duel will work is you only roll 2 dice. Your cubes, again, don't play a role in a duel. So you just compare the numbers. If your number's higher than the other person, so if you have like a 7 in close combat and their highest number is a 6 in magic, you'll get a bonus to defeating them. And then if you defeat them, you either get to take away a life crystal or a gold or a treasure or a shadow cube. And if you're wicked and they're wicked and you take away a shadow cube, that shadow cube's going to go on Der Verdammt. Der Verdammt. Also, if a player doesn't have any shadow cubes and they manage to win a duel against someone who does, they get to take the shadow cube off, and it just leaves and goes into the stockpile. It doesn't add on to Der Verdammt's power. More often than not, though, players will end up kind of having a race for shadow cubes to see who can have the most shadow cubes, like in a lot of fantasy kind of mythology and ideas about good and evil, which fantasy explores oftentimes. It seems a lot easier to go the shadow route than it does
to go the good route. For example, you could run into, there's a lot of monsters like this. In fact, I think most of them that aren't gray dot monsters are monsters that give you shadow cubes. So you could just, you know, pick to challenge the monster with something you're weak in. So say if this shaman here wanted to fight with close combat, there's no way he could possibly win, and he could just get a shadow cube every turn, and then just hope the game ends. If you're content with a lesser victory, you can also win by beating Derverdampt, and then you get a greater victory. So I think which way you go might depend on what other people are doing, because if you go the shadow route, it kind of becomes a luck fest in a way. It's like whoever gets to the tile that adds the shadow cubes first, but I guess you can do things where you can decide whether or not to try to add a shadow cube to yourself, or to try and take a shadow cube from the other person, which also adds the shadow cube to Derverdampt if you're going for shadow cubes. So there's some choices to be made. But then it might also depend on what a greater victory means to you over a lesser victory. For some people, I think a victory is a victory. And so, for example, if you were to, say, cheat at a game, you might still feel like you won the game even though you were playing a different game than other people. That might be, in some people's mind, a lesser victory. But in others, it's just a victory, and you won, and you got the money, and you got, the glory, you got the fame. So how you got there, is that necessarily important? That's a choice that one has to make when one is in the underworld. What might be interesting to me is how this decision of whether to go for the lesser or the greater victory is influenced by those who are around you and the decisions they make, and how much that decision might not be influenced, and for what sorts of people these decisions are influenced by others and what sorts they aren't. And I think that might be the real heart and area of exploration that this game provides. Not so much the moving the player around and discovering what is on the other side of these tiles and these tiles. Like Under the Shadow of the Dragon, this game can be played either alone or combined with either of its predecessors. Unlike Under the Shadow of the Dragon, however, I think it's probably played best by itself. It doesn't feel like it's maybe designed as much to combine with the others. For example, you have the gnome character who's back here, and she combines her skills when battling, but there aren't necessarily rules for how that would work. Say, for example, if you were to battle a monster who only had a blue dot. So the game doesn't say how to do that. Also, you have the dwarf characters and the mage character and the cleric character from the earlier games whose powers don't really translate well into the underworld. Overall, the game's quicker, it's darker, there's less room to breathe. You're going to be using these little number things more and these cubes a lot less, so you're going to be thinking about them more. Overall, this game is tighter and more condensed and less about route selection, a lot more about balance and management. You don't want to have unhindered growth of cubes. You really have to think about where you place a cube, because having more cubes in a skill is not necessarily better all the time like it was in the other game. Helden in der Unterwelt.